Get started. Thank you for those of you who were able to join us in the middle of the day for this webinar on trauma. And I am very grateful to Mike Boucher, who is spending this time with us today. Mike is a longtime friend and colleague of ours. He's been the chair of the Word and World, a People's School board for at least the last 5 years. He is a longtime member at Spiritus Christi Community, which is an alternative Catholic parish in Rochester, New York, that is doing powerful work, and we are very grateful to have a close relationship with them. And Mike is a licensed clinical social worker for the last 20 years. And we've talked over the years about his interest in narrative therapy and in trauma, and I'm looking very forward to our conversation today. My recent interests in trauma, of course, have piqued my desire to have this conversation, and Mike, it is a gift that you're willing to be with us this afternoon to share your experience and your wisdom and also your time with us. So thank you very much.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
Today we are going to take on a challenging topic. And so I want to begin with the words of the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney that speak to our theme today and also give us courage. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that the farther shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. This webinar is entitled The Biology of Trauma. The language of trauma is familiar to most of us. Indeed, some of us use it quite loosely and broadly. That was really traumatic when referring to driving in Los Angeles, me for example, or shopping at a busy grocery store, etc. Today we are going to look at the biology of trauma, how a traumatic event affects us, our functioning, health, and relationship, how it impacts us personally, our families and communities, how it manifests or festers or is even passed on, and strategies for working towards healing. So to begin, I want to look for a moment at the etymology of the word and its roots in our biblical tradition. Trauma comes from ancient Greek, and it means wound or damage. Its first appearance in the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible is germane to our theme today. In Genesis 4:23, we meet Lamech, the progeny of Cain, who we remember as the first murderer in the primeval creation and fall narrative. Cain receives a mark to protect him from blood vengeance as part of his banishment from fratricide. Several generations later, however, Lamech vows a politics of escalated vengeance, archetypally representing the spiral of violence in human society, or what psychologists would call the repetition compulsion. Indeed, just 2 chapters on in Genesis, we are told that the earth was filled with violence, causing the Creator to lament the human project. Lamech's vow of vengeance, 77-fold, is later cited by Jesus of Nazareth in Matthew 18 in his challenge to the church to embody a moral alternative to the spiral of retribution. In the same vein, the term trauma also appears in the famous lex talionis, or law of proportionate retaliation in Torah. And in the prophetic literature, we encounter the notion of the collective wound that results from violation. For example, here in Jeremiah, the wound is described in terms of devastating a household. Here we see hints of the profundity of trauma in the human experience. Indeed, Jeremiah longs for the day that communities are no longer captive to wounds that extend from generations. The fact that he cites a proverb describing such intergenerational trauma indicates that this was an all too common experience, and one the prophet hopes will come to an end. It is also germane that the only appearance of the word trauma in the New Testament is found in the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, which was precisely an object lesson in human empathy and solidarity. So the scriptures thus invite us to an apprenticeship of the wound, and this is what Mike and I want to investigate in this webinar. My own interest in trauma is very personal. A few months ago, I completed my Doctor of Ministry degree, where I looked at barriers within my tight-knit Mennonite community in building relationships of solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And one of the barriers that I researched was the impact of intergenerational trauma in my community. I grew up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and all four of my grandparents came from Russia in the 1920s, after experiencing significant violence during the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. One historian writes that from 1917 to 1921, they survived a continuous climate of violence, plundering, rape, mass killing, and extensive bloodbaths with gruesome mutilations. My grandparents' generation refers to this period as Zerrissenheit, literally translated as the time of being torn apart. About 22,000 of these Mennonites escaped to Canada, leaving 80,000 of their co-religionists and loved ones behind. And as a child, I knew that something horrible had happened to all four of my grandparents, but for the most part, I, and then other descendants who participated in my research, heard only whispers of these stories. But the reality of intergenerational trauma has had a profound impact on our community and on my family. And even though we endured, relatively speaking, only a brief period of brutality. Jeremiah's prophetic hope for an end to intergenerational trauma is echoed by two contemporary researchers studying its transmission. Here, Gilead and Bell write, "The rememberers are those who have the traumatic event registered in their consciousness without actually having experienced it themselves. The second circle of witnesses to the violent experience." So my interest includes how I carry the trauma that my grandparents went through and its impact on me, my family, and my community. My research looks at how intergenerational trauma reverberates in a community across generations. In the late 1980s, the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder began to develop. And in the last 15 years, the study of trauma has become very popular, dealing with events all over the world. and there is now a recognizable field called trauma studies. My focus is on inherited trauma, and Mike's is on, for the most part, experienced trauma, dealing with people who have experienced or suffered trauma themselves. So again, I'm very grateful to have this conversation with Mike, who is approaching the questions of trauma from this experience and from his 20 years perspective. So after we have had a chance to hear from Mike, I will come back briefly to my own biography and do a little bit of work around inherited or intergenerational trauma. But now, Mike, I want to turn it to you, and I thank you again for joining us and for leading us through the bulk of this webinar.
Great.
Oh, and
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mike. I wanted to mention, Mike had said, and maybe you heard this at the beginning, that he's very open to taking questions of clarification or of interest as we go along. So please chat those questions in, and I will watch the chat box, and then I'll go ahead and interrupt Mike and try to put some questions to him. So please feel free to do that. Okay, thanks, Mike.
Great. And am I doing the slides from here on in? Is it?
You are. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. It's really good to be with you for this, and with all those who are out there in cyberland following now, and for those who will watch it in the future. I guess I would also say too, initially, Elaine, you mentioned the difference between inherited and experience, and so many people who I'm working with have both. Mm-hmm. And I think we kind of have to keep that in mind, that trauma is generally in this culture and in this world not a one-time event. There are multiple things happening at all times, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later. I thought I'd start by just trying to clarify some terms, just so we're talking about the same things. People may have different understandings, but these are some very kind of simple ways to think about trauma, stress, PTS, and PTSD. And so when we think about stress, it's really just some kind of pressure or tension that increases anxiety. I know I felt some of that today for the webinar. There's the technology pieces, you got a deadline, something happening. And anxiety can actually be a motivator in a lot of ways, but stress also does stuff to our bodies and our psyches. Trauma, on the other hand, is probably a maximum form of stress, but what the technical definitions would call it, that it's an overwhelming experience, quote unquote, outside the norm. That we have sort of a set of life events, and then something happens outside of that. Now, I put an asterisk because many of the people that I'm encountering and talking to about a lot of these ideas or issues or experiences, these are actually becoming the norm for their lives. They live in contexts of severe deprivation, which is one form of trauma, an ongoing and persistent one. They may have been mugged or abused or subject to some sort of physical violence, which is another form. They may have been devalued in numerous ways. So trauma, I know, just takes on many different forms, but it's kind of outside of what we might expect to find every day. And then really the major difference between stress and trauma is that in stress, we feel like we have some sense of control. In trauma, it's outside of our control, and that does something to us. Now, for me, this next point, PTS versus PTSD, are really important because I think the word PTSD gets thrown around a lot and gets applied to anyone who's gone through anything. Oh, you got PTSD. Oh, you got PTSD. And PTS is really just post-traumatic stress, which everyone goes through. If I were to, I think about a car accident that I got into quite a few years ago. I went through post-traumatic stress for a certain amount of time, and it did not turn into the disorder. About 10% of people who go through traumatic events are supposedly diagnosed with the clinical disorder, which means 90% of people resolve post-traumatic stress in some way. And that, I think, is an important piece to kind of just keep remembering, that there are a lot of mechanisms by which we are healing, and then there are some mechanisms which are very difficult to heal. But by and large, people have a lot of capacities to make it through stuff. And so part of my work is continuing to try to strengthen the things that are already working in people's lives so that we don't get to the disorder. Just a few quick assumptions, that there are biological processes that are activated, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about today. Having people re-experience trauma without context of safety has a high likelihood of re-traumatizing them. Like just asking somebody, hey, what happened to you, is not always the best way to go through it. And also in my work, I found that some people don't actually need to re-experience the trauma in order to heal from it. One of my mentors, Michael White, one of the kind of founders of narrative therapy, said that people are always responding to prevent, minimize, or modify the effects of trauma in their lives. And we're not going to talk so much about it today, but in terms of therapeutic approaches, that's really where I'd locate myself in trying to find out not just what happened to people, but how are people and how did people try to respond to it. So really stories of resistance. And I also have been really challenged by people like Vine Deloria, who wrote a book a few years back, Vine Deloria Jr., I think it was called Evolution, Creationism, and Other Myths. So really knowing that what I'm talking about today fits into a Western scientific view and that many peoples around the world view the human very differently and have different stories about not only humanity, but what happens to us. So I really want to make space for that conversation at some point too, if people wanted to speak about other ways of understanding the human and what happens. And I'm not a neuroscientist, so there are some things I say which neuroscience may say differently, so I'd believe them. Kind of one of the fundamental pieces, Dr. Paul MacLean came up with this idea. I think it was back in the 80s, but I don't remember when exactly, that we have three major parts of the brain, starting at the base of the picture, what's called the reptilian brain, which pretty much controls all the really essential things we need for living: hunger, digestion, primary organs, nervous system, reproduction, sleep, all that stuff. Moving up, we have called the middle brain, or also the mammalian brain, where in that section of the brain we start seeing emotional regulation. We see connection, the formation of community, social networks, pleasure and fear. And then the most recent development, which we share with other creatures, are a more complicated cortex. And to the best of our knowledge, the humans have the most developed cortex, including the neocortex and the frontal lobes, which is where a lot of higher order thinking, so-called higher order thinking, happens. Because when we look around the planet, it seems like other species with quote-unquote lower order thinking do a really good job of organizing themselves, and higher order thinking doesn't seem to go very far some days. So let's talk about the emotional brain, because again, all this stuff will kind of build on each other. If you take together the sort of reptilian and the mammalian brain, sometimes called the limbic brain, they're referred to as the emotional brain. This system is not as complex. The neocortex is really designed for different types of connections. So this middle brain, this emotional brain, thinks in generalities, and that will be important to our conversation later on. Generally, it's almost considered instinct because you don't have to think about it. If there's a car coming at me and I'm in the middle of the street, I don't really try to focus on what's the license plate and what model and make of car this is. I just get out of the way. And when the emotional brain triggers, it sends signals, quote unquote, faster to other parts of the brain. We're talking just a few milliseconds, but that's enough to be the primary source of information for other parts of the brain. So these words low road and high road will come into play later when we think about how do we help ourselves change our brains, or at least connect with our brains. And also the emotional brain is partly responsible for empathy, and it picks up on visual cues in particular about the emotional states and intentions of others. And this will also be important because, as we'll see, trauma changes how we interpret incoming information. which may impact greatly our ability to have emotional connection with other people and understand them and their emotional state. If you haven't come across this man, Dr. Daniel Siegel, he is really someone I would love to direct you to. He started off as a neurobiologist and now is presenting at places like the Omega Institute, because he is overtly drawing connections between biology, spirituality, world peace, compassion, and it's really some great work. But he has a very simple model for the brain. Basically, if you take your hand, oops, let me get my hand here, fold your thumb in and put it over, then this is the model of the brain that he's working with. Here's the neocortex. And as you lift the neocortex, you get to the limbic system, the middle brain, and then this is the brain stem, the reptilian brain. Now, I'm speaking about these as if they're separate parts, but I forget what it is, like there's 10 billion neural connections or something like that. I really don't even know. So everything is in conversation with something else, but this would help you understand where these things are located, and he teaches this to the people he works with, and I teach this to the people I work with, because sometimes just even knowing which part of the brain may be working at that given moment helps you gain greater control of it. So it's a very simple model, yeah. All right, again, if we're moving too fast, just stop me or chat in, but I'd really love to leave some time at the end for more conversation, and so I'm going to kind of move through some things just to establish kind of what's happening. So we're talking now middle of the brain. These are structures that are at the command center. So the thalamus is one of the organs in our brain where all sensory information comes, and the thalamus kind of says, here's what's happening. It takes this information, so if there were a loud bang behind me right now, my thalamus would be the thing that's going to interpret that first. And I hope you can also see, just like if there were a loud noise behind each of us right now, we would probably jump up in the air or try to get away, which tells you how fast these processes are working. It gives us an appreciation for just the complexity of this. But the thalamus also starts to ask the question, is this going to harm me? And when it comes to the word harm, it actually doesn't matter. If we think it can hurt us, then it can hurt us. So that's another piece of this equation. Perceived harm is pretty much the same as someone outside of us saying, yes, this thing can hurt you. So then the thalamus is in conversation with these almond-shaped structures called the amygdala on each side. And the amygdala, if it is a threat, activates the hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus, and that activates something called the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, which ramps us up. And the amygdala also kind of asks, can I handle this now? And that's where the PTS is. And that's also where the D comes in. Because if it's a very overwhelming experience, the brain tends to store the event until a later time when it can process it. So chemicals get released, and then there are structures called the hippocampus, which you can see on either side. It got its name from looking like a seahorse. And it's involved in memory and learning and the sequencing of events and their emotional content. And again, this will become important when we see later what happens during trauma. All right, so the brain on trauma, a few things just start happening. This emergency system gets activated. Lower brain functions are engaged. Fight, flight, and freeze. Some of you may have heard of those kind of three options. I also have to add, in recent years, I've come across some information that the presence of oxytocin, which is more prevalent in women. There's some work, really interesting work that a group of kind of feminist theorists are looking at in California. There's a response called Tend and Befriend.
Yes.
That even under trauma, women mostly have demonstrated an ability to overcome fight, flight, or freeze, and do tend and befriend, which is really an amazing, something I'm going to be studying more about, and I think would merit our studying more about. So anyway, cortisol and adrenaline are released, and people talk about adrenaline highs. That's because that's what it does to the body. It ramps us up. Our heart rate increases, blood to the muscles starts to increase. The neocortex, kind of the higher decision making, gets overridden because we don't want you thinking too much during these times. Quote unquote if any of you, like if you were on an airplane and sad to say, or on a bus and they said, I'm sorry, we're going to crash, and it were an actual emergency, you wouldn't say, God, I'm really hungry. Functions like eating and digestion get shut down. You don't want blood going anywhere where it's not absolutely essential, and so you want it directed to the muscles. That also includes the immune system. And then, if you remember, the hippocampus is involved in memory and learning, and during trauma, memory gets altered, both in terms of time and space, and also sequence. So the body is very keen to, I think in some of those slides, Elaine, you talked about, like, nobody forgets. We always remember things.
Right.
It's just under trauma, if it doesn't get sequenced, it has the ability to intrude in current life. I won't go through all of these. Many of these, even if for everyone who's on the webinar, if I said, so what do you think are some of the emotional and psychological symptoms of trauma and the physical symptoms, we could name a lot of these. We kind of know what happens to us. There's shock, anger, feelings of guilt, maybe sadness or hopelessness, confusion, anxiety, withdrawal, feeling disconnected. And then we might notice we can't sleep, or we have nightmares, hyperarousal, aches and pains, fatigue. Speaking of aches and pains, I've been doing some work in the past maybe 10 years with refugee communities here in Rochester. And there's been a lot of work with different refugee communities because different communities, different cultures carry pain, especially traumatic pain, in different places. So, for example, many Somali women, when they were first coming to Rochester, had tremendous back pain. And there was nothing wrong with their backs. And so one of our local doctors and researchers began to inquire more about trauma. And it seemed that many Somali women carried what had happened to them as lower back pain, whereas other cultures had headaches or neck pain. So for anyone who's working with primary care people, because very few people from other cultures would go to a therapist or clinician first, they would see a primary care. And so there's a lot of overlap between paying attention to trauma and in the primary care room when people are expressing what hurts. So those are a few of the more common effects. There's always possibilities for severe effects like psychosis and other things, but these tend to happen, and they, you can have some of these and they disappear for a while, and then they come back with any trauma reaction, but then particularly with the disorder, many of these tend to show up at later times. So I guess I always tend to say this, that the trauma system that our body possesses in terms of response, it really is an amazing, it really is astounding. I mean, the body's capacity to heal from very, very difficult events. And so acutely, our system is wonderful. And most people recover from post-traumatic stressors in days or weeks. Homeostasis is reestablished. And even some of the trauma reactions, when we're able to utilize our medial prefrontal cortex, right up in here, which is sometimes called the watchtower, that can override some of what happens to us. Just sees from a different vantage point and essentially tells the body, I know this looks scary, but it's okay. Similar to maybe you've had this experience where you've seen a shadow, or you're walking down a trail and there's a stick that looks like a snake, and you begin to respond to it, but then something about you realizes this is not what I think it is. So, but trauma can cause us to become stuck. It also increases the risk of our body sensing further trauma. These are called false alarms. So some of our systems get compromised. They begin to distort how we might interpret incoming sensory information, how we might interpret the eyebrow raised of somebody's tone. And the kind of classic neuroscience phrase is that neurons that fire together wire together. So if any of you have ever tried to change a habit, it's a matter of trying to get different neurons to link up and link up repeatedly so that it becomes the default that the body goes to. So literally, when we talk about trying to change our minds, we are trying to change our minds. I mean, it's a neural pathway that we're trying to change. And this last point here, I mean, probably goes without saying, but it really, we need to keep remembering that for many people, modern life and ongoing conditions like poverty, loneliness, high stress work, racism, sexism, violence, they actually keep us in an elevated state of arousal, which keeps our ANS on. And remember, the ANS is wonderful short term, really bad long term. And I think we have time. Let's watch this video.
How do we carry social class in our bodies? How does it get under our skin?
As you go, being relatively poor, having job insecurity, all of those things will decrease control
are we
over
getting sound?
people's lives. And all of those things are likely to increase risk of illness.
Got it, sorry.
And there are good biological reasons why that might be the case.
When we feel threatened or don't have control in our lives, one critical biological reaction kicks in, the stress response. When the brain perceives a threat, it signals the adrenal glands to release potent stress hormones, among them cortisol. They flood your bloodstream with glucose, increase your heart rate, raise blood pressure. They put your body on alert.
Cortisol improves memory, it enhances immune function, it helps you reestablish energy supplies. Mother Nature put all of this stuff in there to help us survive.
Stress helps to motivate us. In our society today, everybody experiences stress. In fact, the person who has no stress is the person who's dead.
A normal stress response spikes up when needed, then turns off. But what happens when pressures are relentless and you lack the power and resources to control them? When the stress response stays turned on for months or years?
These systems begin to work overtime. We produce too much cortisol. Chronically, cortisol can impair immune function. It can actually inhibit memory and even cause areas of the brain to shrink.
When you get prolonged activation of these stress pathways, they in turn affect heart rate variability, the ability to handle insulin and glucose, and those in turn we think increase risk of diabetes and heart disease.
Because of the stresses and the wear and tear on the body's systems is reflected ultimately in higher rates of disease and accelerated aging.
In our society today, everybody experiences stress. However, in many disadvantaged communities, what we have is the accumulation of multiple negative stressors, and it's so many of them, it's as if someone is being hit from every single side. And not only that they're dealing with a lot of stress, they have few resources to cope.
So that's a clip from a series called Unnatural Causes by California Newsreel that I would highly recommend if you want to pursue some of this further. That it's a great series. So to just reinforce what they said in the video, when the ANS stays on.
Can I, Mike?
Yeah.
I just want to interrupt that the URLs for the videos are right below the YouTube references, folks. If you weren't able to hear that, they're right there. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah. No, it's all right. And if you go to YouTube and just type in unnatural causes, you can, I think, watch the entire program, so it's accessible. Anyway, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. Again, you heard all those things that it does. And the parasympathetic, which brings us down, is kind of turned off more and more. And it's estimated between 80% and 90% of visits to a doctor's office are associated with stress. So the long-term, to sum up, long-term effects of trauma, cortisol remains in the bloodstream. It's like keeping your foot on the gas, to use, if you're revving your engine. Immune system gets depressed. Depression tends to increase. Our lower brain functions, which are fight, flight, and freeze, start to become more prominent in daily living. We get a greater sense of disconnection. Essentially, another way of thinking about trauma is disconnection. It disconnects us from ourselves, disconnects us from our spirit, disconnects us from people around us. And then you also see some emotional fluidity. It changes how we make decisions, and we start to probably have more perceived threats. This is also another part that when I'm working with people in trauma, we spend a bit of time here, that the emotional brain also has external triggers. For example, that part of the brain loves chaos, risk-taking, work, sex, pornography, kind of any of the things that become addictions, those tend to juice that part of the brain very easily. Caffeine, nicotine, and other stimulants responds to fatty foods and sugars. And what are now being thought of as inflammation responses, like a lot of intestinal, you start seeing, if you start eating a lot of fatty food and sugars, we start having inflammation responses. So you might have intestinal problems and other stuff, but all of these are linked. And if you look at, one of the connections that a lot of people make between individual trauma and collective trauma and intergenerational is, if you look, for example, at very impoverished neighborhoods and corner stores, what are most of the foods that are available to people? They tend to be almost all triggering foods, high sugar, high fat, in some of the most traumatized areas. And so there are some real profound links between what people eat. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about what's wrong, and please tell me there's some good news in here somewhere. And so that's where we'll shift for the next little bit. So the good news is trauma can be healed, and when I say healed, I don't mean forgotten. It just means healed. It doesn't take the prominence in our life, but it is something that people can move through. Generally, we don't heal very well though until we feel safe. And that's kind of a crucial piece. And so how do we create safe spaces for people, especially in contexts where trauma is ongoing? And I think the medical and mental health community really has a lot more consultation to do, because oppressed communities have been about this work for a very long time. Many people have had to really try to heal under very difficult conditions, and we can learn a lot from them. So one of the keys, though, is that we need to intervene after PTS so that it doesn't become D, and helping people reestablish just daily rituals of living. Telling the truth is a really great first step, and we'll hear more from Dr. Joy DeGroy in both, maybe I think what Elaine might say and some of what I'll focus on. And then I think we also see this in the work of Joanna Macy, just kind of, deep connections that help us name what is wrong. Help us name what hurts. I know in my field, the clinical world, the individual stuff gets privileged a lot, but I'm talking collective ways to help people heal. And traditional cultures and rituals have known this for a very long time. And I think it's always important for us to ask not just what happened to people, but how did you respond to what happened? And there's a great Canadian clinician named Alan Wade, who's been doing some amazing response-based work along with a colleague of mine, Vicki Reynolds. All right, so some practical applications. One thing we can do with people is just, if you like what you heard today, or if it's true for your experience, basically just telling people this is what happens in your brain. and sometimes even knowing what happens helps people begin to get greater control of it. Moshe Feldenkrais once said, "You can't do what you want until you know what you're doing." And I use that with a lot of people, just to try. How do you get a sense of what's going on? What are you doing now? And then how do you change? And so there are top-down and bottom-up approaches. That's one of the things we'll focus on. Another will be stories. We have to be very careful about the stories we tell or retell, because they can actually keep us incredibly stuck or can help us get free. And then we need to address intergenerational trauma. So again, if you have any questions or comments as we're going along, feel free to just type them in, and I'd love to have some level of conversation on this, but if everybody's good, we'll just kind of keep moving through. So top-down approaches, this would fall under the real heading of mindfulness. Really, one of the key things that a lot of trauma work is doing these days is focusing on mindfulness. How do we help the cortex, the watchtower, kind of regain its place? So we want to help people just become more aware of what are the sensory inputs that they're getting from their bodies. Many people who've gone through some form of trauma have disconnected in some way from their body. And particularly that's true for people who have suffered physical abuse, sexual abuse, and many other harms to their bodies, that their bodies were rendered unsafe in some way, and so they have disconnected for their own safety. But ultimately that means that some of their sensory inputs aren't fully integrated. So our agency really helps us start with our interoception. How do we get back into our bodies? And how do we reconnect with feelings of pain or pleasure? What's safe, nourishing, what's harmful? And mindfulness practices have shown to increase the parasympathetic, the relaxation response. They've been shown to increase our empathy, increase choice, decrease fear, increase ability for memory and decision making, and all that type of stuff. Some of our great teachers around this have been the Buddhists, who have been studying this for a very, very long time. And so, there are ways that just so many of the world's traditions can offer us pieces of this. So in the world I'm in, a little more of the clinical world, here are some other top-down approaches. There are the therapeutic approaches, which in traditional talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy or things like that. There's a particular form called EMDR, which some people may be aware of, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Francine Shapiro is the kind of person behind a lot of that. What's wild is we really don't exactly know how that works. We just know it seems to work, because it seems to, if we use a computer analogy, it changes something about the memory so that when the body goes to look for it, it's not where it thought it was. And so it decreases the emotional content related to it. Then there's someone named James Pennebaker, who back in 1986 did some amazing studies that writing literally helped people heal from what they had gone through, as opposed to talking. Neurofeedback has been helpful, and then some culture-specific rituals that I could say more about, but I'll just kind of leave it at that now, that there are some things that make sense in different cultures on what do you need to do in order to heal. Looking
Mike,
at something that just came in, yeah.
there is a question here. Oh, it's from the BCM office. Chris is typing in, I'm interested in how we go about identifying the long-term stress trauma as opposed to the more obvious traumatic single event.
Yeah, it's a great question. They actually kind of manifest almost the same way. So if you go back to the slide of what are the common effects of trauma, I think it's really hard to say that this is the result of X and this is the result of Y, but you'll probably see elements from both the physical side and the emotional side. And so I don't know if that gets at the question enough, but unfortunately there's a lot of overlap. And Yeah, let me think about that as I keep talking, and if I can do that. So the other side is the bottom up approaches, which essentially you do something to the body and that changes the mind. And so yoga, for example, is becoming one of the go-to approaches to help people heal from trauma, but also things like Tai Chi, Qigong. And essentially in yoga, for those who've practiced it, I am not a big practitioner, but I am very closely involved with someone who is. You really are constantly focusing on body sensations, the connections, pain, how to push through, what happens next, things like that. Someone I've trained with, a guy named Paul Boyle, does these kinds of things where, for example, if you stand straight up and then near a wall and lean back into the wall and then let your body slide down the wall so that you're now almost sitting, your back is up against the wall, but your legs go out and then down, and just hold that position. Eventually, your core and your legs will start to shake because your muscles, this happens in yoga poses as well. And Paul Boyle learned this he spent like 25 years in the Sudan. He ran a refugee camp. He has helped many people throughout Africa do healing. And he's been taught by a lot of the Africans that shaking and dancing releases stuff. And he uses the example too, if you see an antelope, for example, that has been knocked down by a lion, but the antelope is in freeze mode, and so the lion goes away. The antelope, a few minutes later, tends to get up and start shaking. It shakes from its ears all the way down its spine, right to its tail, and then it moves on. So there are a lot of processes that we can learn from, but massage, body work, dancing, singing, movement, and then things called somatic experiencing. Peter Levine and Pat Ogden are two of the clinicians who've really worked on that. But these are all bottom-up approaches. Food and mood, there are serious relationships between the amount of carbohydrates you eat and elevated levels of depression. There are connections between food and inflammation responses, meaning like asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, gluten, all kinds of stuff. There's a process called neurogenesis, which helps us strengthen and even create new brain connections. We heard that cortisol, when it's in the bloodstream for a long time, can erode brain connections, and neurogenesis is the regeneration of these. Exercise is probably one of the best things we can do for ourselves to both heal from trauma and to address brain cells. Fasting, it's very interesting, and eating fewer calories all seem to have positive effects. And if you look at the United States of America, we have lost a ton of exercise. We eat more calories than we ever need, and fasting generally isn't on our radar. And so, when I hear some of this stuff, I think no wonder trauma has such a foothold. And then I think of BCM and all the work you do. That nature, one of the best places for people to be after trauma is in natural contexts. There's something about nature which is safe and reconnects us and to natural rhythms, a sense of place, and all those kinds of things when we've become very disconnected. I mentioned this very briefly. If I had to spend a weekend with just about anybody, I would go spend it with Ken Hardy. And if you ever get a chance to hear him, he's just a really amazing teacher and clinician and person. But he wrote a pretty profound book along with Tracy Laszloffy in 2005 called Teens Who Hurt. And he's studying why young people are violent. And this, to me, just has a lot to do with trauma, that he found 4 key variables: that people are devalued, there's a disruption of their community somehow, their losses are dehumanized, basically not recognized, and these taken together start to form rage, which then generally gets expressed as violence. And generally, if these are present and they're not attended to, they lead to very severe traumatic reactions in people, and sometimes that trauma turns into rage, which turns into the next generation of violence.
Huh.
There's a field emerging, and I feel like I'm just blowing through things here, so I hope it's not too fast. I have a sense of myself talking way too quickly here.
Mike, this is how these things go. Questions will come up. We are taking it in, and then questions will come. It's great. Thank you.
So this other field, which I find both fascinating and exciting, called epigenetic research. Now stay with me on this. It's a pretty simple thing, but this is with mice, but it's been replicated. So now I know if you have ethical considerations with respect to animals, this may not sit well with you, but they made a group of mice afraid of a fruity odor called acetophenone, I think. And so they kind of puff the odor into the air and then shock the mice. Okay, and so that these poor little things start to associate the smell with pain. And so what they noticed, though, as they studied these mice, was the brain began to reorganize, that there was more activity around the nose in terms of being able to pick up this smell. But 10 days after the fear training, the mice mated. The offspring, known as the F1 generation, who had never been exposed to the smell or the shock, showed an increased startle to the fruity smell even when they had never encountered it. Now, they didn't show it to another smell. Get this, the F2 generation, okay, the offspring of the offspring, show the same increased sensitivity. Now, you have to decide what you want to do with stuff like this, but if you put it in a trauma frame, it means that people go through stuff, their children inherit something from them about what they went through, including sensitivities, higher developed sensitivities to pick up on the trauma, and even the kids went through an increased sensitivity. Now this is just for one trauma. Don't forget, this was exposure for 10 days. Imagine, what happens when multiple things are happening all the time. This is in a clinical setting. And so this really starts to move into very broad categories for me when we take it out of the individual realm. And then some of you may have heard of what are called the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, which I think were done by Kaiser Permanente in California. I think with very, very large numbers of people. I mean, it's a massive study. And they found that there are certain experiences that are major risk factors for illness and death, as well as the poor quality of life. And this just has incredibly broad implications for education, community building, criminal justice. Parents who had high ACE scores have the likelihood of passing on experiences through their neural and behavioral networks. And I think a lot of Richard Rohr, who's been a great teacher for me, who basically says pain that is not transformed is transmitted. And the science really seems to be backing this up. So the more we can begin to develop a trauma-informed perspective, like what we're listening for, particularly like intervening with young people and their parents, we might be able to have some ability to intervene and prevent the continued, transmission of things over time. Now, stories are also really crucial. And I'll maybe just read a little bit of this. The way we feel about our past, why people behaved as they did, the impact of these events on our development. It's all our life stories. The answers people give to these fundamental questions reveal how this internal narrative may be limiting them in the present, and might also cause them to pass down to their children the same painful legacy. This last line is one that I think is worth repeating. The best predictor of a child's security of attachment is not what happened to his or her parents, but how the parents made sense of it. And that seems to be a big piece of people's healing is how they story and understand what happened to them. So, for example, I've sat with some people who've gone through some horrible things in their personal lives, but from a faith perspective have said something like, well, God kept me safe through it all. And for some of those folks, that was the difference between PTS and PTSD.
Yeah.
That they had a coherent story that helped them. But a lot of people and a lot of cultures and communities have had stories taken away, have had stories and meaning systems and structures ripped from them or literally beaten out of them. And that changes now how you understand what's happening to you. So, Elaine, you'll be talking about this in a few minutes, I assume?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've...
But
yeah.
the stuff you've got is different. I mean,
Okay.
you can leave it, and we can go back to this slide however you want to do that.
Yeah, I'll just mention, this is someone
Yeah.
I've spent a good deal of time with, Dr. Joy DeGroy. Although I've heard her name pronounced DeGroux, I'm not quite sure how it's said, but she wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, which has been really utilized here in Rochester to try to understand how do we especially think about the difficulties of the African American community here, but in many other places. I'll also just say there are a lot of ways of thinking about this. She's not the only one. Ken Hardy has done some of this work, and then there are some people who take issue with her way of framing. But I found it really helpful, including these key patterns. And Chris, this may get at your question a little bit too. Like she was talking about what are behavior patterns that may be reflective of historical trauma. And so she talks about this vacant self-esteem that people just, it's a real sense of hopelessness, self-destructive outlook, propensities for anger and violence, and then learned helplessness, distorted self-concepts, stuff like that. But again, you can see that some of these overlap with that list that we had earlier. It's hard, vacant self-esteem, that could happen to someone who has a history of sexual abuse as well. I think we have time. We'll maybe watch this video briefly.
This is important. Whenever you do historical trauma work from a practical perspective or a research perspective, we always start with the goodness. Always start with the beauty.
We come in all shapes and colors and wonderful variations. What makes us American Indian is our values and the way that we look at life, and the way that we look at community, and the way that we look at each other.
All I can say is gratitude that I feel for the work, for the people, for the ways, for the indigenous knowledge that has been preserved in spite of. We don't do therapy. What we do is heal.
Cultural healing is connecting people to their cultural identity through understanding traditions, customs, and practices.
All of our tribes, all of our communities have protocols and codes of conduct about how we conduct ourselves in the world, how we are expected to be a good human being, how we are expected to relate to the land and place and space, how we are expected to relate to future generations and to our ancestors. Even when people don't know their original instructions, it's a good question to ask, because that's part of the healing process for our communities, is to find out, well, how is it? What does it mean to be a good human being? What does it mean to eat well? What does it mean to conduct ourselves in certain ways?
Cultural healing is examining the effects of historical trauma, not only within a single individual or family, but across entire communities.
Working with elders in a community to find out what were the original instructions for the people, and then what were the events, the community events, historically traumatic events that happened to a particular community, and then how did the community respond? So what were the survival strategies? And then layering on top of that, then what were the family's responses, the family that you might be working with? So that creates this kind of three-dimensional way of looking at, over time, how historical trauma has impacted the community, and what were the survival strategies, and whether those survival strategies are still working or not. So it gives a family a chance to reflect on that.
Community says that everything I do will affect someone. And culture says to you, I must carry forward, even if it's pain, those things that have become tradition and habit and practice. Carry it forward. I have to examine it at this point. The reason it becomes intellectual is because I have to examine it. Think about it. Be conscious of what I'm carrying forward. I say to my grandfather, now even, I carried forward the resiliency power. I'm not necessarily carrying forward the pain in the way you did, but I'm carrying forward the beliefs that you had and the values that you had and that which you did to resolve the pain for yourself.
How do we get people there? I'm going to tell you how to get people there. You're going to connect them with somebody in their community. You're going to come to them with authenticity and love, and you're going to listen, and you're going to listen to their story, and you're going to say, I get it.
Cultural healing is listening, caring, and giving voice to what is carried forward across generations.
A lot of what we do, though, is conversation, contact, connecting, looking in the eyes of the people who sit with us. Listen to what's behind the eyes of the people who are with us. Listen, listen, and listen some more. And whatever is said, we go deeper. Whatever is said, we know is only part of what is meant. It doesn't go around and around. It goes down and down, deeper, behind the pain. What is it that you cannot say? Most of us can deal with what I can say, but what can't I say? Can you reach and connect with what I cannot say? What I do not have words for, what I only have songs for, what I only have stories for, what I only have poetry for. Can you reach that? That is an African way of being that we want to reconnect our people to.
Reconnect and reestablish these relationships. That's relationships to self, body, mind, spirit, culture, community, history.
You come to a person with love and authenticity, they're going to trust you. And if they trust you, then they get an experience of, wow, I can trust this person I can share with. And you make that connection, you don't know what they're going to do. They're going to go out and they're going to tell somebody else. And they're going to tell somebody else. And pretty soon you have a community. So when you think about healing, do not underestimate your ability to be an agent of change.
All right, thanks. And Joy, Dr. DeGruy asks a question that, for example, I think really has a lot to do, as a white person, for example, working in many communities of color. Really, this is a profound question. How are you equipped to come into my community with no training and prior knowledge of my culture and community? And so in terms of being an agent of healing, I don't think it necessarily takes one to heal one, but I think if we find ourselves in contexts where we are moving and we're not really sure of who are the cultures that we're moving in, what's the community and what are their traditions and how do they heal, we need to do a lot of our own homework and reconnect people with their own elders and not necessarily try to connect them more strongly to us and clinical methods or things like that. And then I think in terms of also cultural practices for white people to heal, this is where racism has torn a lot of white people from their own historical roots as well. And so we don't even know how our people got through the things they got through a long time ago. So there are just so many facets of healing work that you can do when it starts coming to intergenerational stuff. But that white culture generally is just bankrupt from. And so when we turn to it, I think we mostly just have consumerism, which means read another book, go to another workshop, try to take something else in, and I'm not sure that's very healing. So there are some references here that I've talked about, and then if anybody wants to try to connect with me somehow, here are some different ways to do that. And I think I'm at the end of everything I can say.
Everything you've got to say. Mike, thank you. Thank you very much. That, for me, was so helpful in understanding how that works in our brain and how Yeah, it is impacting us personally, individually, families, communities. Thank you for that real helpful and powerful presentation. Friends, I want us, oh good, there are some folks that are typing. So questions are coming in. And of course, Mike, what you put out there sparks a whole bunch of stuff in the work that I am doing as well. Yeah. Faith is saying here, deepest gratitude as a 9/11 survivor, continuing to struggle to heal in myself and in the world. Now, Mike, maybe what you can do, maybe I'll go through the last bit of my slides, and as questions come up, let's just start addressing them as they come. And I feel like one of the things that is coming up for me, my community, part of why I looked at intergenerational trauma was to look at a community that came from trauma, but immediately, not immediately, but very quickly could slip into the dominant culture within a generation or two and easily pick up the white skin privilege. I mean, I am the granddaughter of the refugees that experienced significant violence, and so how is that trauma impacting my ability to actually relate to and work towards solidarity with Indigenous people? So I think there are a lot of us on the North American continent that have a history of trauma generations back that we are not wrestling with, and not wrestling with the impact of that. But I'll go ahead and keep. Chris, where's the slideshow?
Sorry, I think I made the question thing too big. I may have just... And
I'm blaming Chris. Sorry, Chris. Right. Well, are you seeing questions there that you want to do?
I just, the chat is such a small box, I can't see the whole question or the comment at any one time, so maybe we can just return to those after you've done what you've done.
Okay, let me keep going. So, as Mike has alluded to, there's been many recent studies also done on the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And in my research, you'll see pictures here. I looked primarily at work done with descendants of Holocaust survivors, Armenian genocide, and then also in the Canadian Indigenous communities. These studies have found that trauma is passed down biologically, epigenetically, through family systems, and then through communal narratives, and I'll look briefly at each of these in a few moments. But this phenomenon has been documented in a wide range of cultural groups and communities who've experienced war, slavery, genocide, and other political oppressions. And so they are finding that intergenerational trauma can be transmitted both through nature and nurture. Mike defined trauma, and I want to add, maybe I'll just add the top definition there that I've found very helpful. A traumatic event is described by the American Psychiatric Association as a non-ordinary human experience consisting of a serious harm or threat to oneself or relatives, or to one's property or community. This for me is helpful because, again, and maybe it is because I primarily was working with a privileged community, European Mennonites or European Canadian Mennonites in the prairies, that again, this loose using of the word trauma, I had to get very specific about what I was talking about. So trauma caused by intensely personal violations such as sexual assault, torture, slavery, or military combat is most difficult to recover from compared to, for example, a trauma response to a natural disaster. Mike also described PTSD. PTSD is also a significant factor in the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And so just briefly to refresh our memory, PTSD describes a syndrome in which a trauma survivor is unable to get the violent event out of his or her mind. So survivors are haunted by scenes of the violation in nightmares or flashbacks. They experience panic attacks, heart palpitations, and severe physiological disturbances. How this has impacted me, and this is just my paternal side, but my grandma Ence saw soldiers hold a gun to her husband's head on 3 different occasions. He is the only survivor male survivor out of his village. I don't know if my grandma herself was raped, because there has been significant silences around gendered violence in our community. But in her later years, after my grandfather had died, she struggled with hallucinations and believed there were Russian soldiers sitting in her living room threatening to take her back to Russia. And she also imagined phone calls in the middle of the night where soldiers told her they were coming to get her. She was so angry at one of my cousins because my cousin started to sleep there with my grandmother to try to help her, and she was very angry with her because my cousin didn't pick up the phone, and my grandmother had to deal with these soldiers yelling at her. So I do wonder how the violence that my grandmother experienced has been passed down to me. Trauma, again, can be transmitted intergenerationally through these 5 ways, and so I'll just look at each of them briefly. Trauma can be transmitted intergenerationally through family systems. One researcher found that offspring of Holocaust survivors were more vulnerable to developing PTSD just by witnessing their parents' chronic PTSD. And some descendants experienced PTSD symptoms just from hearing about Holocaust-related events. And so I wonder, what did my father and his siblings inherit from my grandmother's PTSD? Other studies looking at parenting styles, communication, suppressed emotions in family systems. For example, one study showed that survivors of the Khmer Rouge killing fields in Cambodia typically used role-reversing parenting. And this means when a parent looks to a child to meet the parent's needs of intimacy, comfort, or play, and then the child attempts to meet those needs. And so this type of parenting often led to anxiety in the next generation. A study on my Mennonite community describes how Mennonite women who survived Stalinist Russia often withheld compassion and rejected their children because they were not sure that their children would survive famine, war, or the long trek out of Russia. And a study of Kosovo survivors of war and ethnic cleansing found that children's depressive symptoms were significantly related to their father's struggle with PTSD. There are many studies showing that the children's were adversely affected by their mothers struggling with PTSD. These studies also showed that their fathers' struggles impacted them. Dr. Rachel Lev-Wiesel is a researcher and claims that trauma gets passed down as a family legacy whether or not survivors speak about it. Most of my research subjects said they wanted to know more about their parents or grandparents, what they went through, and then a few described how their parents talked about the violence they endured ad nauseum. So again, as we are going through this, and I encourage us, those of us that are descendants of white settlers, to think about the patterns and habits in our family. Were there stories of trauma that were talked about incessantly, or were there ones that were just alluded to obliquely? What are ones that no one ever talked about at all? And part of my interest is in the Mennonite community, there is a victim mentality that we often speak about, and that is what I am trying to challenge in my research. Again, Mike mentioned epigenetics, and I have a little bit of a different study that I looked at. Again, it's a relatively new field of study that looks at inherited changes in gene function. So survivors of life-threatening experiences such as war, torture, slavery, or famine can develop changes to the chemical coding of their chromosomes, though not their structures. And so this coding becomes a sort of cell memory and is passed on, like other genetic characteristics, intergenerationally. Progeny, thus, can carry a kind of physiological footprint of the trauma. And these studies were looking at starvation and how that was impacting generations later on. I'm sorry, this is a disturbing picture and faith. This is about the 9/11 violence. Other studies reveal that trauma effects can also be transmitted through biology, for example, to children in utero. So a study was done on expectant mothers who were exposed to the World Trade Center attacks in September 2001. These mothers were in their third trimester during 9/11, and as a result of witnessing the collapse of the towers and subsequent events, developed PTSD, and then were found to have lower cortisol levels. And Mike, I would love a discussion with you about this. In turn, their babies, again who were in utero during 9/11, also showed lower cortisol levels in their first year of life. And the researchers are saying this is significant because lower cortisol levels increases the development of PTSD. So these children who were exposed to trauma in utero have a higher likelihood of developing PTSD when faced with their own traumas. And again, I am no neuroscientist either, and so this is my understanding of reading these studies. And lastly, I just want to look at communal narratives. So in addition to the effects of trauma on individuals and families, collective experiences of trauma have adverse consequences that are communal, long-lasting, and cross-generational. Again, in my research with my community, I found that there were silences in the communal narrative about gendered violence that almost no one spoke about. Some survivors talked or wrote about murder, the disappearance of loved ones, starvation, home invasions, but very few spoke about rape or sexual assault. So the survivors made generalized statements like, all the girls and women over 12 were raped. Or they would speak about the rape or sexual assault in third person or about witnessing it. Many acknowledged that rape or sexual assault was a very common occurrence, but no one told their children or investigators or researchers that they had personally been raped. And again, for us with white settler legacy, I invite you to reflect on the silences in your community's narrative. What painful pieces have been suppressed that were or are taboo to talk about, and what were denied, delegitimized, dismissed, or damned? What I have found is that the silences around these narratives create vacuums that then we tend to fill in. On the other hand, what are the traumas that are talked about ad nauseum so that we are unable to work at healing? What are the pieces of our communal narrative that we need to heal or transform? The silences, I think, in the Mennonite community around the privileges that we received both in Russia, Ukraine, and then in Saskatchewan. Those stories of how we got that land, those stories are the ones that are also silenced, along with what the women experienced. But the stories we tell, maybe ad nauseum, is what hardworking farmers we are, and what a blessing we are on creation, taking marginalized land and making it productive. Those are the stories that fill our communal narrative. And then of the violence that is acceptable to talk about. One more thing, another phenomenon regarding communal narratives has been described by researchers within Indigenous communities in Canada. They describe how collective trauma has unique social and psychological trajectories, particularly if a group shares a specific identity or affiliation, such as ethnicity or religion. Traumatic events occurring across generations build synergistically and are understood as part of a single trajectory. So the Indigenous peoples in Canada have experienced multiple violations for almost 500 years, and of course those same violations would apply to the Indigenous people in the U.S. Losing land, losing ability to hunt and practice their religious ceremonies, being incarcerated, forced to attend Indian residential schools, which has led to addiction and poverty. So these multiple traumas have become synergistic, and the poverty, addiction, and abuse that we see on reservations now is a direct result of the synergistic traumas of colonization. Mike mentioned Joy DeGruy, and again, her description of the ideology of the many of the adaptive survival behaviors in African American communities throughout the U.S. is a condition that exists as a consequence of multi-generational oppression of Africans and their descendants that began with centuries of chattel slavery, and then of course is followed by the institutional racism. So Mike, have you at all been keeping track of the questions that have been flying by? Why don't you open that panel up, and then we can start looking at them.
This is helpful. Thanks.
So this first one, from Weldon, I'm deeply grateful. My closest dealing with trauma is ministry is with people without homes around the church and people suffering from war, particularly in Iraq with CPT. A year ago I was in CPT in Iraq, Kurdistan, working with these people who had just experienced huge trauma from ISIS. How do you relate trauma to war?
You want me to answer that?
You know what, Mike? I'm putting that one first to you. Yeah.
Okay. I will also go back before that. I think Chris had asked the question, symptoms versus causes. Do you focus on symptoms versus causes? And that's actually going to relate to my answer to this one. If something is not problematic for people, I don't focus on it. And so, yes, I do tend to focus a little bit more on symptoms. I would only focus on causes if we're talking about like injustice, illegal practices, some things that may need, but that's not where I start necessarily. So in this case, how do I relate trauma to war? That again, I would probably just have to say it depends. It depends on what people have gone through, and going back to that definition of trauma that is quote unquote outside the norm of human experience. Some people for generations now have been living in conditions of war and threat, and have found ways to navigate and negotiate. Just like in the United States, and I can't speak for Canada, but I assume there are cultures like indigenous cultures and the African American community and others who would consider themselves in hostile territory, and they have had to find ways to navigate everyday life, which may cause trauma but may not cause disorder. And so, yes, the traumas of war are huge, and a lot of people finding themselves in that will have many symptoms, some of which won't show up for years. That's the problem, is some of them won't show up for years, because again, some of the symptomology of things don't show until people feel safe, or even like 16 to 24 months after people feel safe. And so people kind of live through a lot of things, and then at some later time start experiencing something. And it's not quote unquote repressed memory. It's the body kind of holding off until it's okay. Weldon, I want to just hold up your work, and if people don't know the work of CPT, it is a great witness, Christian Peacemaker teams. But I'm not exactly sure what you meant by the question, so I don't want to answer it too much, because I may be going down a road that's not useful or responsive.
Thanks, Mike. Francis Loberg, at the end I'd like to hear from both Mike and Elaine about ways to do trauma stewardship, stay connected while working as a healer, working with people with many kinds of trauma, and perhaps in an environment with many kinds of trauma. And Mike, I would love to turn that to you, and I can say a few words after, but if you'd want to tackle that.
I would. I'd love to say, sometimes in the work I do, people say, I don't know how you do that work. I could never work with people who've gone through stuff. And I just want to be really clear from the beginning. People don't traumatize me. People who've been through trauma don't traumatize me. Trauma traumatizes everyone. I mean, we're all victims. But I think there's this subtle victim blaming that happens sometimes that I need to speak about. That it's the injustices, it's the violence that traumatize not only the person, but when they come to see me, we're both now sharing this thing. But that's where my focus, Francis, particularly on resilience, particularly on people's strength, particularly on ways they have responded to what's happened to them. Those conversations just tend to be a little more energizing and hopeful, so that when we approach trauma from that way, and I think you heard that speaker say it in the cultural healing piece, you start with goodness. It really is important to start with goodness and not with deficit, because people are going to be very, very aware of the deficits. They are aware of one question I ask, and this could be asked of individuals, but it could also be asked of communities. If I ask them, what has trauma taken away from you? I must also ask the corresponding question, what has it not taken away? Or what hasn't it been able to touch? And then that gives us kind of two directions. We can acknowledge the losses that have happened, and some of those can't ever be recovered. You can't take back some things that have happened. But then when we start talking about what hasn't it been able to take away fully or touch, like people might say, I can still care for my kids. We say, well, how is it that trauma hasn't been able to take that away from you? It's just a very different narrative that I know I prefer working with, and the people and communities that I talk with prefer working with. That doesn't deny pain, but it doesn't just leave us there. And that might also get at Pam's question a little bit later on too. What are your thoughts on that, Elaine?
Yeah, Chris is giving me some. One of the thoughts for me, coming out of this question, one of the studies that I read was about resilience in faith communities, and it really struck me how practices of singing together and doing Bible study, and these researchers, aren't necessarily identifying as people of faith, but the practices that we do together as a faith community, singing, Bible study, acts of altruism, when we go out and help others, giving meaning to the suffering that the community, and again, I am speaking from a Mennonite perspective, making meaning to understand the trauma and put it in the social context. All of that, these researchers were saying, leads to raising cortisol levels and building resilience. And so I think participating in a community of faith helps us in our healing and keeping us healthy as we are doing the work that God has called us to do or has put before us. So I don't know, Mike, if this resonates with you, but in terms of participating in your community at Spiritus Christi, to be aware of all the goodness in our lives, helps us accompany and help other people recognize and be grateful for the goodness that is there. So that is what came up for me.
Yeah.
Are you seeing another question there, Mike?
I'm seeing something from Pam, a person with white skin privilege trying to work every day in an anti-racist way, to how to use this knowledge as a facilitator and when dealing with other folks with white skin privilege, especially when meeting resistance. Could also seem as if the story is not helpful to a person of color dealing with the trauma of racism. Perhaps we should stop asking people of color to tell the stories. So are we re-traumatizing people of color when we ask them to do so? Are there others working on dismantling racism in this way? I don't know if we're re-traumatizing people. I can only tell you most of my experiences in cross-racial work privilege the experience of white people and privilege the healing of white people. I wish that weren't the case, but that's just been my experience. There are other ways of doing this. So I think many people of color who come into cross-racial circles actually know this, and they're participating knowing full well that they may not benefit fully from the conversation. My guess is people of color have circles where they can speak safely, or that would be something that I am trying to connect people to, because I may not be a safe person for them to speak with. I might be understanding, but I may not be safe in the sense of there are things I might not understand, or an offhanded comment could really open up some woundedness. So I don't want to minimize the answer. I think we have to be cautious when asking people to tell their stories, any story of harm, that are there conditions present that make it safe enough for somebody, because I don't think any space is truly safe for people who've been marginalized or hurt. It's just safer space. And, as a white person, I don't get to determine really that the space is safe enough. I need to be in constant conversation with people of color or people who are marginalized or people living in poverty or women to say what kind of space can do that for you. Under what conditions is it possible to tell your story and have it witnessed? But going back to the work of Ken Hardy, that if we use those words, devaluation, the dehumanization of loss, so disruption of community, then any spaces that we create, we want to try to value what people are saying. We want to try to value who they are and believe them. We want to link their stories in terms of community to larger stories, and to reconnect to other traditions. And then if there are any losses, we want to make sure we pause and attend to those somehow, that they're at least named and acknowledged. So again, your question is a fantastic one. There's Weldon's question would be a whole webinar, and I'm not probably a good person to. There are much better people who could attend to this question, Pam, and that would probably be something maybe for the future. Weldon's question of what do you do when working in contexts of war would be a really important one, I think, potentially for CPT folks to really take up. Share their experiences, but then also people who have lived in and negotiated contexts of war and how they still found joy and gratitude, and return to laughter and singing in the midst of those contexts, and how did they do longer term healing work that was necessary for them? When did that become possible?
Mm-hmm. You know, and I would just add that those of us that do carry white skin privilege, and those of us that want to help and want to do the work of healing in our community, for me it has just become so apparent that we need to learn the history of the land that we sit on or that we occupy, and that is a long history. And again, just speaking personally, in Saskatchewan, where born and raised and part of the farming Mennonite community there, we do not know the history of that land, and so we don't really grapple with the great privilege that has been given to us from the moment we landed on that space. Who was there before us? What were the violence that they experienced as a result of colonization, but that we then benefited from? And I really, that is one of the things that I really want to encourage those of us of Euro-American or Euro-Canadian background to. That is a significant piece of our anti-racism work. You, Pam, are in Australia, and I know you know this, but I encourage people. Do you know whose land you're living on right now? And are there people that are descendants of the original people, the indigenous people of that land, that you can begin to build a relationship with? We have things that we can say into that space if we have done our work around how we got to be on this land. What was the horrible violence that happened on this land so that we could come here, and how are we beginning to redress that? That is the piece that I'm interested, that I think is before us as descendants of settlers in our different countries.
Something I'll just really briefly say that it's come up a little bit in my work recently in Rochester, just as a white person moving in some communities of color, having to also be willing to hear from communities of color that I don't have a role in their healing, that they're going to handle it. And I've got healing I need to do with other people. Getting at that, Pam, I think deep in your question is a huge challenge for those of us who are white is if you're dealing with other folks with white skin privilege who are giving resistance, that's our deep work. It may feel better for me to be around people of color and assist in their healing, but part of the healing work is to stop. I'm just this video by a clip by Malcolm X that says, if you got a 15-inch knife in your back and they pull it out 7 inches, that's not healing. Even if they pull the knife out all the way, that's not healing. That just means the knife is out of your back. And so how do we work with communities that are still, especially in my case, I'm a white person, the white community is still causing harm, is still causing trauma. And so part of my work is not just to try to help other people heal, it's to try to stop the white community from doing more harm. And I have access to those people in ways that many other people don't. So.
Friends, I am realizing we are 10 minutes past our time, and I don't particularly, Mike, want to hold you too much longer, but I thank you. So, friends, we are okay to keep chatting. This usually happens for a while, but I will formally close our time down. And Mike, thank you so much for helping us begin to understand a bit of what is happening with the biology of trauma. and for giving us, as Seamus Haney says, hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge and pain and trauma, and also for talking with us about practices of resilience and of healing and cures and even miracles. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll let the chat continue. I have to, or I want to, always plug our next webinar. This is our third Bartimaeus Institute online launch, and it will be an introduction to Sabbath economics. And of course, Ched and I, this has been one of our key pieces we've been working on for the last 20 years. We'll look at our Sabbath economics sevenfold household covenant. So please, if you are able to join us, we will return to regular time, Tuesday, October 27th at 5:30. So please, if you can join then, please do that. And again, we'll leave this chat going for as long as people are commenting. And thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.